I'm Jim Walker from Temporal, and I'm joined by two gentlemen from JPMorgan Chase that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past, 6 or 7 months. Devon, I've only known you about a month, but
Yeah.
Rajesh, I've gotten to know you a little bit more. Let's just start with just introductions. So Rajesh, do you want to who are you and what do you do at the bank?
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Rajesh Iyer, and I'm one of the principal engineers on the JPMorgan, I should say Connected Commerce architecture teams. So JPMorgan is basically broken down into three broad areas. One is the consumer bank, then there is an investment bank, and then there is wealth management. So I'm part of the consumer bank, and I'm part of the architecture group within the consumer bank as a principal engineer.
So I'm Devon Thompson, under the same org as Rajesh in terms of connected commerce. I head the architecture team for consumer and small business payments. So all your Zelle and paying your credit card and that type of stuff, we handle.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of an oddball just to get away.
Sure.
Is JPMorgan Chase a bank or a technology company?
JPMorgan, I think, wants to be a technology company. I think if you look at our technology budget, it's like $12 billion a year. So I think tech is a huge part of JPMorgan. And, I think over the last, I would say, last couple of years, they have really made a lot of strides in terms of adopting AWS and adopting newer technologies and stuff like that, adopting open source. So I think we are becoming more and more of a tech company than a bank.
Yeah, and I've been working with the bank for a couple of years. I've seen it as well, Rajesh. Like there's a definite sea change, especially when it comes to like public cloud. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but it's fascinating to watch a legacy organization completely transform into a tech company. Quite honestly, I think it's awesome. But we're here to talk a little bit about kind of the bank's journey into Temporal and some of the way y'all are using it. Rajesh, how did you guys first get introduced to Temporal? Where did it come from?
Yeah, so we there were other folks or other teams that were using Temporal in the bank before we started adopting it, and that's how we sort of came to know about Temporal. And they were primarily using it for infrastructure automation kind of use cases, and we. Our boss, rather, Matt, he asked me to look at Temporal and look at it from a, what we can do from a workflow standpoint, right? And from a modernization standpoint, right? How we can bring in Temporal along with our modernization agenda. So I started playing with Temporal, built a lot of example applications and stuff like that. Did a lot of internal evangelism. So that's the journey that we've been on. So I think it's been now 8 months since we have looked at Temporal. Yeah, and we are still on the journey, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting that infrastructure deployment use case seems like a gateway. Yeah, it's a gateway workload that actually just turns people on. Like you get experience, and you're like, oh my God, this is kind of cool. Wait a second. Yeah. You start to see it in other places. Were you guys evaluating other frameworks?
Yes.
I guess, do you use other frameworks that are kind of similar or providing some of the same capabilities? And kind of what did you go through when you were kind of like evaluating, looking at those sort of things?
Yeah. So we went through a comprehensive evaluation process, right? So we evaluated Spring State Machine. Basically, so as part of the modernization agenda, we needed something which will orchestrate across microservices, basically, right? As we take out our monolithic applications and build microservices, right? So we needed something which will orchestrate the microservices, right? So we looked at different things. We looked at Spring State Machine. We looked at Axon, Sagas. So Axon framework has a Saga component in it, and then we looked at AWS step functions, and also we looked at Temporal. So I can go into the details of how the evaluation played out, but then basically at the end of the day, I think we are in a place where Temporal is the winner out of all the evaluation that we have gone through, and So
how does that work then? I mean, are you using Temporal? I mean, I presume people will still use step functions for certain workloads and whatnot,
absolutely.
right? I mean, I get a winner in that evaluation, but I mean, there's a suite of tools that people are going to use, right? There's
So we're not saying that it's a one size fits all, right? So step functions will be a use case where you need some sort of orchestration, but then if you need durable transactions, if you need compensating actions, if you need long running workflows which can span days and months and years, right? And one of the things that we wanted to go through was workflows as code, right? And the testability of the workflows itself, right? So things like step functions, I mean, it's got its own proprietary language, Amazon's states language, and then you cannot test it locally without going to or without using Amazon's infrastructure, right? So I think those are some of the key decision factors in selecting Temporal, and of course the workflow UI and the console that we get to look at each activity and look at the state of each activity. I think those are some of the important considerations as well. And then developer productivity was one more, where we looked at the amount of work it takes to build a workflow in all of these technologies, right? And I think Temporal, the developers absolutely enjoyed working with it, and they embraced it very quickly.
Yeah. So just on that note, before we get into some more of the use cases, Devron, how do you guys spread the knowledge of this, right? Because there's like a lot of tools that you can use for various different things. You've been through evaluation. It's like we said, it's kind of a tech company. There's thousands of engineers. How do you help them kind of choose or help educate them that this is the tool for? I mean, it's workflows everywhere, right? Like everything's a workflow for once you see it, but how do you get them kind of in on it or help them kind of become aware of where Temporal can fit in their jobs?
Yeah. So
That was a workflow.
that was workflow. Yeah. So I think there are Chase is obviously JPMC is a big company, right? So there are various engineering forums and architecture forums where basically things get bubbled up, and that's some of the things that the evangelism that I'm doing is basically going to these forums and presenting Temporal as a solution where people can look at it and then basically evaluate it for their own use cases.
Yeah. So thank you, and I love helping you with all those things as well, Rajesh. So JP Morgan Chase is big, right? There's
Huge.
retail banking, there's investment, it's massive. Wealth management, yeah. Are you guys in a central function, or where do you work within the bank, Devron?
So we handle like I say, consumer and small business payments. So consumer being, individuals as well as small businesses. Once you get a company to a bigger size, then they generally go into the commercial sector. But so we handle small business and consumer. And the products we handle are like Zelle. Zelle is our highest transaction. So I'm sure a lot of people use Zelle. Bill payment, where you can go online and pay any bill, pay anybody. ACH, the way you get paid, direct deposit. We have wires, international wires, so you can send international wires. Then we also handle the payments for the Chase products. Pay your credit card, pay your mortgage, pay your auto loan. So all of these payment areas we handle in our area. And you can think of it like Afterpay and Instacart. It's like an order when you deal with a payment. So it has a life cycle. You have to do a fraud check. You have to make sure the money is there to be able to handle the payment. You have to deliver the payment. You have to do anti-money laundering checks. So a bunch of different steps to make a payment from start to end.
Everything's workflow.
Yep.
To the best that you guys can share, how much is Temporal involved, and kind of what are the use cases that you're using it for? Is it all of those? Is it some of that? Is it something else?
Whatever solution we come up with, it should be for all of those things. We want to build a standardized way of doing payments, because at the end of the day, a payment is moving money from point A to point B at the end of the day. But I mean, there's a lot of different rails at the end of the day where you deliver. So if you think about e-commerce shipping, you may ship a t-shirt from this warehouse with a fridge from another delivery warehouse. And that's kind of how payments are. You have different fulfillment of payment. And so we want to be standardized as much as possible, as well as give each individual team an autonomy to be able to do some of the stuff they want to do.
Yeah.
So how much, like in terms of, I look at complex workflows and I think of like almost kind of like you could kind of identify pieces that could be shared across various different kind of use cases as well. Are you guys also looking at that? Like, are you kind of like starting to think about how workflows can be like intermingled, or because I mean, look at ACH and Zelle aren't that far apart, but they're different, right? Yeah.
So we think about things like fraud checks.
Right.
We
Exactly.
want to make that as an activity that all of these workflows can use. The workflow for Zelle versus ACH may be different, but they may share that same activity of doing a fraud check. They may share the same activity of doing going to the checking account to secure the money, things like that.
Right.
I mean, your settlement process could be, standardized as well, right? So you could have a child workflow, which basically does the settlement by itself, right? So you could have a common workflow across different types of payments, and then individual child workflows. So I think we are going through the design still at this point. So
yeah. It gets really interesting when you see how these things are going to start being shared, or how do other teams even find out? You know what I mean? So where does it fit into kind of the stack of one of these? Like where does Temporal kind of like in the set of tooling? What else is there? I guess where does it fit?
So it should be in the core of the payment transaction. So if you look at a payment, you have the user interface from the mobile apps to the web. So those will be different services that interact with what we call a product service. So each one of those products will have their own product service, and that product service will integrate with Temporal to say, okay, now start this workflow and be able to track it in one place end to end. We have a foundational team as well who will build some of these core capabilities, and the individual products like Zelle, they will have their own capability services as well. And each one of them we envision having their own workflow because they're different but the same at the same time. So
you're still pretty early in kind of the implementation of this.
I mean, each individual, as Deborah was mentioning, right? Each individual product will have its own namespace.
Sure.
And they'll be able to run their own workflows.
And then we also have to look at some of the other teams and integrations that we have. Some of those are not event driven, so we still got to do batch jobs to ACH, for example. Nacha doesn't support real-time events, so we have to build files and make sure they get it. They send us back files and responses. So we may even look at those scenarios and say, maybe Temporal works, or maybe step functions works for that little piece in that area. So still some design to go.
So when you look at kind of modernization and going from one place to the next, what do you see kind of Temporal obviating? Like, what is it, what goes away, right? Like, because it can do a fair amount, right, Rajesh?
I think a lot of the, I would say, boilerplate code, your retry handling, failure handling, compensation logic, right? All of that is now handled by the framework, handled by Temporal, right? And the developers are purely focused on writing their workflows and activities, right? And they don't worry about, state management.
That's right.
Right? And, persisting the data in stuff like that, right? So I think a lot of the common patterns that we talk about, right? Event sourcing, state management, all of that is abstracted out into Temporal, and then the developers are purely focused on writing business logic.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, we want to be able to reduce a lot of our batch jobs. So we're very batchy still today. And so things like recurring payments, we have jobs that run every day to say, okay, what's the recurring payment coming for tomorrow? So maybe those are, scheduled.
Yeah, I got a feature for you. It's called schedules.
Exactly.
That's right.
So we could maybe eliminate a lot of those batch jobs that go and try to pull payments to schedule for tomorrow.
Yeah, it's like finally an upgrade to cron.
In
this world.
So scheduled workflows is an important feature that we want.
Yeah. So moving a little bit from that, there's a lot of different infrastructure that goes into basically deploying an application, queues, databases, all that. We talked about public cloud as well, Rajesh. Like, how much is this is running in? I don't know. I'm not going to call out a cloud provider, but like public cloud versus kind of on-prem at the bank at this point. Like, where will this all kind of go?
Yeah, I mean, we did the POC on the public cloud using Temporal Cloud. So basically, we had our workers deployed on AWS in ECS tasks, and we connected to Temporal Cloud through a private link connection, right? So our infrastructure was, both client and server completely on AWS, right? There are other folks in the bank who have their own on-prem deployments of Temporal Cloud. Temporal Server.
Temporal Server.
Yeah. So, they're basically doing self-hosting. But I think personally, I would like everybody to go to Temporal Cloud because of the scalability and the resiliency that Temporal Cloud will offer compared to, a self-hosted solution.
Yeah.
But our goal is also to get all the payments into the AWS, and so with Temporal being there, it makes it a lot easier, a lot less latency we got to deal with and hops and stuff like that. Because latency is very important for us. You think about someone making a Zelle payment, they click pay, they don't want to
get my money.
They want a response right there that it was successful or not. So we don't want to wait 5 seconds. We want to be a lot quicker.
So people choosing between self-hosted and cloud managed service. Is it they aren't aware that it's available, or is it more like is it along the lines of like use case driven, like hey, look at like certain data has compliance issues or whatever? How much of it is kind of one or the other?
I think I would say the latter, because a lot of people don't know that there is a Temporal Cloud. There is people started the Temporal journey before the Temporal Cloud was available. Sure. So that's why they went with a self-hosted solution. But then when we got in, the Temporal Cloud was available when we started the POC. So we basically were built on the cloud.
Yeah, and those mission critical apps, it depends. I guess the data is really what kind
and then
of
things like global namespaces. When we deploy a payments app, it's going to be an active setup, right? So global namespaces are going to be very critical to us to be able to fail over seamlessly.
Yeah. So modernization of something like an older payment system into this is risky for many. I mean, I've countless times in my career where I've heard people like, nobody touch that. Like, don't touch that code. The amount of stuff that still runs on IBM Series 1 out there is just kind of phenomenal to me, right? Like, it's amazing. So when you start thinking, and I'm not saying these workloads are those, but like when you start thinking about modernizing, how do you think about like helping the teams understand like how to integrate Temporal into that journey, right? Because it's not easy. You can't just like change it all and flip over one day, right? Like, how do you go through that modernization?
So you want to take?
No, I was going to say, some of the talks yesterday was where people say, I'm able to put Temporal on top of the existing instead of trying to do one big lift and shift or a big change complete. So that's part of the approach we'll take as we build some of these foundational modernized services. So things like ACH delivery or settlement that we mentioned, some of those services we're going to build a standalone and then figure out a way to incorporate.
Temporal. You don't have to necessarily have a microservices ecosystem already in place to be able to incorporate Temporal, right? So you can take your monolithic app and then incorporate Temporal and gradually work your way towards peeling the onion, basically. So.
Yeah, and I think the talk from Twilio yesterday, Pragna was talking about just peeling off a function and then wrapping it with a deterministic workflow so that you get the benefit of resilience and scale out of that, and then gradually working through the application is tough to do. Is there a way to think about apps like where you start with that journey, or is it just kind of pick off what you want to do, right?
So we have a roadmap of some of the modernization we want to start with. One of them is, one of the products that I talked about. So we're going to take that and build a small, take a small chunk of the traffic and try to build something in a modernized way using Temporal, using all the latest, greatest services that we want to use, and then start from there and build out the foundational stuff. Mm-hmm. And then as we build that and prove it out, then the other products can come on board, and it'll just be a blueprint that we have that makes it easier for everybody to, to onboard to the new approach.
So we talked a bit about Temporal Server and running that as a service internally. What about workers? Are the development teams kind of like managing and dealing with their own workers? Are you guys doing that as a service? Like, how do you provision that side of the game, right?
Yeah. So we are not there yet, but our eventual. So we have something called Photon, which is basically. So we are basically a Java Spring Boot shop, and we have a framework called Photon, which basically does a lot of the. It builds abstractions on top of Spring Boot, right? Essentially, right? So eventually, the way I see it, we will basically build abstractions on top of the Temporal SDK. We'll build, annotations like I think the guys from Australia were talking about yesterday.
The Afterpay team, yeah.
Yeah. So the Afterpay team, yeah. So, things like that, we will do that. And then I think that will make developers' life easier as they build workers and, code on their side.
But we also want each product to be as autonomous as possible too. So we will allow them to probably deploy, but just have a blueprint, standard way of doing things so that it's not dependent on some, one central team. With Chase being so big, if you put that as a bottleneck, a team like that as a bottleneck, then becomes everybody has to wait on this team to get done. So we try to put as much autonomy.
That will include, Java abstractions on top of the Java SDK. There is a lot of opportunity where we can actually use Terraform. We are a Terraform shop, so we can use Terraform to automate some of the Datadog integrations, things like that. So I see a lot of things that things that we can do when we actually roll out Temporal.
Yeah. I don't know. I look forward to the world of serverless workers where, but I think it's kind of difficult to think through the metrics that you use to scale.
Yeah, we can still do serverless workers, right?
Yeah.
So, your activities can be Lambda functions.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, yeah, I think it works within the context. It's the worker side of it is where it gets gets interesting. I see people kind of falling over a little bit. So let's shift. I've kind of gone through. And if y'all have questions, we are going to just save them. We will ask if there's questions in the audience. Sorry, just been kind of doing the conversation here, but we did have kind of a little bit of a script. So we'll shift a little bit into kind of the value of Temporal and like why you guys how did you sell this up, right? Like, this is a new tech, right, Rajesh? And you and I have spoken about this. It's not easy for people to get right away sometimes, right? And if you're going to say, hey, I want to redo Zelle or whatever, some payment thing, that's a pretty risky proposition. How did you talk about the value of Temporal so you could sell up, right? Through the chain at JP Morgan Chase?
Yeah. So I think the value is durable executions, right? And I think the value is that if you can improve the reliability of the system to 99.9999% by introducing Temporal, I think that's where we will have the win. We will have the reliability of making sure that every single payment is accounted for, every single payment is succeeded, or whether it is, even if it's failed, we know what is happening in the system.
I guess when the money is when the data is money, it gets a little easier, right?
Yeah. So we have the the observability, the telemetry in the system, which will basically. So today, a lot of those things are not there actually in the monolithic system, right? So there is, people just look at logs and stuff like that. They spend countless hours looking at logs, trying to debug a situation.
So production incidents kind of speak for itself too.
Yeah.
So we had one today where, you couldn't find a payment, where did it go? That type of thing. So you have to go look at 10 different teams. Okay, it made it here, it made it there, it made it there. But somewhere,
just look at a workflow execution.
Just go look at a screen and say, okay.
Just show you everything that happened.
Exactly.
That's right.
That's the goal that we want to get to.
It's one of those undersold pieces of Temporal, I think, being able to investigate into a particular execution.
Right.
It's gold.
Yeah.
It's gold.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, cool. I think we went through most of this stuff. I guess as a thank you for being up here. And there's a couple of our engineers and product managers in the room. What's the big feature you all need from out of the community or out of Temporal?
For me, it's the update because
workflow update.
Right. So.
Oh, well, we got that for you.
When you look at it from our point of view, customers on the digital app, we're digital customer facing. We want a response immediately. So even though the workflow may take 10 steps, those first 2 steps are usually the most critical, fraud check and making sure you have the money in your account to make the payment. After that, we can respond back to the customer saying it's successful. And then the rest of the workflow can go on. So that
primitive is just awesome. And exactly what they're doing on the SDK team to roll that to everybody, it's just great. So I'm super excited about that too. Rajesh, do you have any other
Yeah, I think update is definitely a feature that we want. I think, global namespaces is another one, which is going to be very critical because, to survive region outages and stuff like that. I think that's pretty powerful.
All right. Well, we had a keynote for you yesterday then that spoke to both those things. And versioning, I'm sure versioning is probably third on the list.
Yeah, versioning is absolutely
I heard a couple of sighs in the room as that rolled out yesterday. Are there any questions out there from anybody? I know it was pretty kind of high level, but there's one back in the, if you guys, I think there's a question right there. Oh, sorry. There's not another one back there? Oh, they only had 3? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Then I'll just yell.
Yeah, so evaluating things for environment like a bank, which probably has a lot of internal and external security compliance requirements. When you bring in a large open source system like Temporal, it relies on open source components. It needs open source database engines to run the underlying storage. Could you name example of challenges you needed to deal with to get this platform approved for use in your teams? Or you don't have those problems and bureaucracy is eliminated?
Yeah, so I don't think Chase is not averse to open source. I think there are a lot of Spring Boot is a classic example of something that has been built in the community, and Chase is openly using it, right? So bringing something open source is not the problem. I think the appropriate security controls, whether we are basically encrypting the data in Temporal, PCI, PI, data compliance, all of those things are more important than just open source, I would say.
So yeah, we use a lot of open source products, but they go through a rigorous process to become approved for us to use, making sure all of these loopholes don't exist in these open source. So we use a lot of them today. We talk about Cassandra, Spring Boot and all, and we're in AWS now. 2 years ago, the bank wouldn't have never thought about public cloud. So we're moving along the way. We're making sure controls are in place. So
yeah,
definitely
we do vulnerability scanning for all the, the jar files and stuff like that. So
I had a small follow-up. So
Sure.
I'll just yell. So the HashiCorp just changed their license, right, for HashiCorp or for the BSL.
Mm.
Does that impact you guys? Like, do you guys care about that, or is that kind of just something that?
what is BSL?
Well, yeah. So they moved from the open source. I think they're Apache v2 open source license, and they moved to a BSL, which is they moved to the BSL license, which basically is Apache v2 after an amount of time, but it calls out that you can't host HashiCorp and make money off it, basically.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they went. I don't know if you guys were familiar with that, but so when license changes like that happen, does it stop usage, or is it kind of like, I guess there's a team that just deals with that world?
Yeah.
procurement team generally deals
Procurement?
with that type of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we are using HashiCorp Enterprise anyway, so open source.
Yeah, that's different. Yeah.
It doesn't. It won't affect us basically.
And then with Chase being such a big company, a lot of companies will adjust some of their rules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I get it.
Yeah.
So.
There's a question there.
Thanks. I forget who mentioned it. Maybe it was Devon or Rajesh. In the evaluation phase, someone mentioned developer productivity.
Yeah.
How are you looking at developer productivity? How did Temporal impact that? Is it a qualitative thing, quantitative thing?
So I'm looking at it from a learning curve point of view, right? How much time does a developer, let's say a mid to junior developer takes to learn a new technology, right? Being that we are a Java shop, the Temporal SDK being in Java was a much easier adoption cycle for us compared to something like Amazon Step Functions, where the developers had to learn the ASL language and all that stuff, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible, but then just from a relative point of view, the Java SDK it gives you much easier. Developers are already familiar with Spring Boot annotations and stuff like that, right? So it's just easier learning curve compared to some of the other frameworks.
And automated testing will be another one where we need everything to be automated tested as much as possible.
Yeah.
With some of the other services, it's hard to to complete end-to-end automated test in those type of proprietary services.
Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you all for your attention and being with us today. Rajesh and Devron, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure getting to the list of questions with you both. And look forward to working with you over the next couple months. So,
And I have a bunch of openings too for architects.
yeah, and he's hiring. Thank you, everybody.